Lieutenant Jack Morin stood in the shadows of the military base, a dark figure against the bright lights of the command center. He was used to the cold, impersonal nature of his work, but today was different. Today, his orders felt heavier than usual. A message had been sent to him just hours ago, with his next mission clearly outlined. Track down an alien widow and her child, and deliver them to a powerful intergalactic corporation. It was a simple mission, but one Jack knew would haunt him. The message was direct and to the point. The corporation had been hunting down refugees from a destroyed planet, looking to profit from their misery. Jack had heard the rumors about what they did to the captured aliens, how they treated them like commodities, not lives. But those details didn't matter. What mattered was that this mission was part of his duty. It was just another job, he thought, and soldiers like him didn't get to question their orders. Yet, as he read the briefing once more, something didn't sit right. Naira, the widow, and her son, Callan, had been hiding for years, surviving in the shadow of war and destruction. They weren't just any aliens, they were survivors, fighting to stay alive. The thought of them being handed over to the corporation made Jack uneasy, but he pushed the feeling aside. He couldn't afford to be soft. Not in his line of work. The sun was setting as Jack walked down the empty hallways of the military base, the sound of his boots echoing against the walls. He had no personal connection to the aliens he was sent to find. They were strangers, nothing more. Yet the moment he set foot on the transport ship, the doubt gnawed at him again. He glanced at the other soldiers aboard the ship, all of them hardened, focused, and detached. They were ready for the mission ahead. No second thoughts, no hesitation. Jack had always prided himself on his professionalism, but today, something was different. Something was stirring inside him, a feeling he couldn't ignore. As the ship left the base and entered deep space, Jack tried to push away his thoughts. He was here to do a job, not to question the orders he had been given. But the closer they got to the refugee colony where Naira and Callan were hiding, the more Jack's mind raced. He had seen the horrors of war, the destruction of entire civilizations, and the suffering of innocents, but he had never been so close to a mission that felt wrong. Hours later, they arrived at the colony. It was a small, run-down settlement on a remote planet, far from the well-established cities and rich resources of the galaxy. The refugees here had no protection, no defense. They were just trying to survive. Jack couldn't help but wonder how Naira had managed to keep her son safe in such a place. She was a widow, a mother, and a survivor. How could anyone treat them like property? He stepped off the ship, his boots crunching on the dry ground beneath him. His team scattered, each of them heading to different parts of the colony. Jack's orders were clear. Find Naira and Callan. Take them into custody and prepare them for transport. But as he walked through the dusty streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was more than just a simple extraction. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would change the course of his life. His eyes scanned the colony, looking for any sign of the two. The atmosphere was tense, people hiding in their homes, afraid to show themselves. Naira and Callan were somewhere here, trying to stay out of sight, trying to live another day. Jack could feel his heart racing as he walked further into the settlement. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't the pull of sympathy that he felt growing inside him. Finally, he spotted them. Naira, a woman with deep, sorrowful eyes, was sitting with her son, Callan, under the shade of a broken-down structure. The child's face lit up with wonder as he played with an old toy, completely unaware of the danger that loomed over them. Naira looked worn but strong, as though she had endured far too much, and yet still refused to break. Jack stood still, watching them for a long moment. The orders in his mind clashed with the reality before him. He had been trained to carry out missions without question, but now, with these two innocent lives before him, Jack wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man, faced with a choice that could define who he was. Jack couldn't take his eyes off them. Naira, the alien widow, sat under the shade, her gaze distant, as if lost in the memories of a time when life wasn't so harsh. Her child, Callan, was different. The young boy was playing with a broken toy, his laughter ringing out, so innocent and full of life. It was hard to believe that these two were living in hiding, far from the warmth of any real home. Jack stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the dirt as he approached them. His mind was racing, unsure of what to say or how to even begin the conversation. His orders were clear: bring them in, hand them over to the corporation. But standing here, seeing their simple life, something in Jack's heart began to change. He had seen war, destruction, and death, but nothing had affected him like this. Naira didn't look up when Jack approached. She had likely seen many soldiers pass through this colony before. Some may have been kind, others cruel, but she had learned to remain cautious. Callan, however, noticed Jack right away. His curious eyes locked onto the soldier, and the little boy stood up, brushing off the dirt from his clothes. "Who are you?" Callan asked, his voice soft yet filled with innocent wonder. Jack's heart sank. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared to speak to a child, to see that look of hope in his eyes. He quickly gathered himself, trying to remain professional. "I'm just here to help," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Naira slowly looked up, her eyes locking with Jack's. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Jack saw something in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. There was strength there, but also a deep sorrow. She had seen so much, lost so much. Jack could only imagine what she had been through. "You're here to help." Naira's voice was low, wary, but with an undercurrent of hope. "Then why do you wear that uniform?" The question hit Jack harder than he expected. He was used to orders, used to the cold, impersonal nature of his work. But Naira's simple question made him feel exposed, like she could see right through him. He stood in silence for a moment, unsure how to respond. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack finally said, his voice quieter now. He felt like he was trying to convince himself more than anything else. Naira's eyes softened slightly, but the wariness didn't leave her expression. "You say that, but I know what soldiers like you do. My people have suffered at the hands of those who promised to help." Jack couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had been part of missions that had resulted in suffering, but never like this. He had seen soldiers follow orders without questioning them, without a second thought. But for the first time in his career, Jack found himself questioning everything. "I'm not like them," Jack said, his voice firm despite the doubts swirling in his mind. "I'm not here to do what you think. I was sent here for a mission, but I don't think I can carry it out." Naira tilted her head, studying him. There was silence between them for a long time, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Callan, still holding his toy, looked between Jack and his mother, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. "Why are you telling me this?" Naira finally asked. "You could take us right now and deliver us to the corporation. You'd get your reward, your fame. Why choose to help us?" Jack's gaze dropped to the ground, his mind spinning. He had been trained to be a soldier, to follow orders. But this felt different. There was something about Naira and Callan that made everything else seem insignificant. They weren't just victims. They were people with hopes, dreams, and a past that was far too complicated for Jack to understand. "I don't know," Jack admitted quietly. "But I don't want to see you hurt. You don't deserve this." Naira stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jack thought she might push him away, accuse him of lying or trying to trick her. But instead, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "You're not the first soldier to say that," she said, her voice steady, yet there was a sadness in it. "But actions speak louder than words. Soldier, I won't trust you just because you say you're different." Jack nodded, understanding her hesitation. Trust wasn't something that could be given easily, especially not after everything Naira had been through. But Jack wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. "I know I'm asking for your trust, and I don't expect you to give it just like that," Jack said, meeting her eyes. "But I'll prove it to you. I won't hand you over to them. I'll protect you. Both of you." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Jack thought she might laugh at him, dismiss him as just another soldier with empty promises. But then, slowly, Naira nodded. Her gaze softened just a little. "Then you'd better be prepared, soldier," she said quietly. "Because once you make that choice, there's no going back." Jack swallowed hard. He had just made a decision that would change his life forever. The air around the small colony felt different now. Jack stood still, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had made a choice. He had told Naira and Callan that he would protect them. But in that moment, Jack wasn't sure what that really meant. The weight of his decision settled in his chest like a heavy stone. This wasn't just about protecting two strangers. It was about defying everything he had been trained to do, everything that had shaped him as a soldier. Naira and Callan had retreated back into their small shelter. Jack could see them through the cracked window, sitting on the floor. Naira's face was calm, but Jack could tell she was thinking. Her eyes never left him, even when she wasn't speaking. Callan, on the other hand, seemed to sense that something had changed too. He was quietly playing with his broken toy, though there was a new, hesitant look in his eyes. Jack's hand hovered over his comm device. His orders were still there, clear and demanding. He was supposed to bring Naira and her son in, deliver them to the corporation for their proper processing. That was the easy way, the way he had been trained to follow. But he couldn't shake the feeling that what he was about to do would be much harder. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew he had no time to waste. The longer they stayed in this colony, the more risk they all faced. The corporation wasn't the only threat here. There were bounty hunters, mercenaries, and criminals who would stop at nothing to capture Naira and Callan. They had been hiding for years, and now Jack had made himself their protector. He could hear the quiet hum of the transport ship as it hovered just outside the settlement, waiting for him. His team would be expecting him to return with Naira and her son. But Jack wasn't going back the way he came. He wasn't going to hand them over. The ship wouldn't be leaving with him on it if he didn't change his course. Jack turned away from the window and made his way toward the shelter. His boots made soft sounds on the dirt, a reminder of the quiet danger they were all in. As he reached the door, he paused. What would Naira think of him now? She had trusted him with her life. There was no going back from this. He knocked gently before stepping inside. Naira was sitting cross-legged, her eyes studying him intently. Callan looked up from his toy, then back to his mother. Jack could feel the weight of their gazes, but he didn't look away. "I've made arrangements," Jack said, his voice steady despite the unease that twisted inside him. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous." Naira raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She had been expecting this. Jack could see it in the way she carried herself, calm, patient, waiting for him to make a decision. She had been in this situation before. She had learned to read the signs and judge who she could trust. "Where will we go?" Naira asked, her voice low and even. Jack hesitated. There were options, but none of them were easy. "I've contacted a friend who can help. He's part of a group that works to protect people like you. We can get you out of here, off the grid, where no one can find you." Naira didn't react at first. She just stared at Jack, her face unreadable. "And what do you expect in return?" she asked. Jack was taken aback by her question. It wasn't what he had expected to hear. "Nothing," he said honestly. "I don't want anything. I just can't stand by and watch you suffer." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Naira nodded. She didn't smile or show any sign of relief, but Jack knew she was weighing his words carefully. This wasn't about trust. This was about survival. And Naira had learned long ago that nothing came without a cost. "We'll go with you," she said quietly. "But you have to understand, soldier, that this is a dangerous path. It's not just about staying alive anymore. You'll be making enemies. Real ones. People who won't care if you're human or alien. You'll have to fight for us. And for yourself." Jack nodded, the gravity of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a battle, one he wasn't sure he could win. But he was committed now. There was no turning back. He had chosen to protect them, and he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. Kalen stood up suddenly, his small hands gripping his toy tightly. He looked at Jack with wide, trusting eyes. "Will you keep us safe?" he asked innocently. Jack's heart clenched. He wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was, he wasn't sure he could keep them safe. But in that moment, with Kalen's innocent gaze fixed on him, Jack made another vow, one he knew he couldn't break. "I will," Jack said, his voice firm and full of determination. Naira watched him closely, her expression softening just a little. For the first time, Jack saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for now. The decision had been made. There was no going back. Jack had taken the first step down a new path, one that would lead him into the unknown. The sun had just begun to set as Jack, Naira, and Kalen made their way through the quiet, narrow streets of the colony. The air felt thick with tension. Jack could hear the distant hum of machinery, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes kept scanning their surroundings, checking every shadow for potential threats. He couldn't afford to be careless now. Naira and Kalen walked beside him, neither saying much. Naira's posture was stiff, her gaze sharp and focused, as if she were constantly aware of her surroundings. Kalen, still clutching his broken toy, seemed less aware of the danger. He occasionally looked up at Jack with trust-filled eyes, as if believing in his promise to keep them safe. Jack led them to the outskirts of the colony, where a small, hidden transport vehicle was waiting. It was old, nothing fancy, but it would get them out of here without drawing too much attention. The engine hummed quietly, its low rumble a comfort to Jack. The transport was the first step to freedom, but he knew it was only the beginning. They still had a long way to go, and many obstacles to face. "Everything's ready," Jack said quietly, glancing back at Naira. Naira nodded, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. She was anxious, but Jack could tell that she was also calculating their next move. They couldn't afford to be seen. Not now. Every moment counted. They climbed into the transport, and Jack took the wheel. Naira sat in the passenger seat, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. Kalen settled into the back, still clutching his toy, his small form a reminder of everything they were fighting for. Jack started the engine, and the transport slowly pulled away from the colony. They moved quietly, keeping to the shadows, careful not to alert anyone that they were leaving. The road ahead was long, stretching out into the unknown. Jack didn't know where they would end up, but he knew they couldn't stay here. As they traveled, Jack couldn't help but think about the people he was leaving behind. His team, the ones who had given him the mission. What would they think when they found out? They would be angry, maybe even furious. But Jack had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. The transport moved smoothly along the road, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. Jack tried to focus, to keep his mind sharp, but the thoughts kept creeping in. What would happen if they were caught? What if they were tracked down and brought back? Jack didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't allow that to happen. Not to Naira. Not to Kalen. Hours passed as they drove through the darkened countryside. The landscape was barren, the trees sparse, and the occasional building they passed looked abandoned. Jack kept his foot steady on the pedal, eyes always searching the horizon for any signs of danger. The night felt endless, but the quiet was oddly comforting. It was a brief moment of peace, one that Jack knew wouldn't last. Naira, who had been quiet the entire journey, finally spoke. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady, but tinged with uncertainty. Jack glanced over at her. He had thought about that question before, but he didn't have a clear answer. "A safe place," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "A place where you and Kalen can live without fear." Naira didn't respond right away. She seemed to be processing his words, weighing them carefully. Finally, she nodded. "You're not just saving us, are you?" she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "You're changing your life too." Jack didn't know how to respond to that. He had never really thought of it that way. In a way, Naira was right. He had made a decision that would cost him everything. His life as a soldier, his career, his connections, all of that was behind him now. All that mattered was keeping Naira and Kellen safe. For a moment, he allowed himself to consider the life he was leaving behind. The orders, the missions, the uniform. But none of it seemed as important anymore. Not when he looked at the small family he was now responsible for. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "I guess I am." They continued driving in silence after that, the weight of their shared understanding hanging in the air. Jack could feel the change in himself, the shift in his priorities. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a protector. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. As they neared the edge of the colony's borders, Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. He could see the faint outline of the hills in the distance, the safe house just beyond them. They were almost there, almost free. But just as he was beginning to feel a sense of relief, a sudden light flashed behind them. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly glanced at the rearview mirror. A vehicle was gaining on them. A military transport, and it was coming fast. Jack's instincts kicked in. He knew they didn't have much time. He slammed his foot down on the pedal, the transport surging forward with newfound speed. Naira's eyes widened, and Kellen's toy slipped from his grasp as the vehicle jolted forward. "They found us," Jack muttered, his voice tense. "Hold on." The chase had begun. The roar of the pursuing vehicle grew louder in the distance. Jack's heart raced as he pushed the transport harder, the engine humming angrily beneath him. His eyes never left the rearview mirror, watching the fast-approaching vehicle. The military transport was bigger, faster, and had more power than his small craft. But Jack had something they didn't. He knew the land, and he wasn't going to let them catch him so easily. Naira's voice broke through the tension. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her tone calm but filled with worry. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them on this open road for long. He needed a plan, something to give them an advantage. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The sound of the other vehicle's engine was deafening now. It was only a matter of time before they closed the gap completely. "We need to get off the road," Jack said quickly. "We're not going to lose them here, but we can try to lose them in the forest." Naira didn't ask questions. She knew what was at stake. Jack steered the transport sharply to the left, veering off the dirt road and onto a narrow path that led into a dense patch of trees. The wheels of the transport slid across the uneven ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The vehicle bounced and jolted as they entered the forest, the trees offering some cover, but also posing a new danger. The military vehicle behind them followed the same path, but it was slower, struggling to keep up with the narrow trail. Jack pushed forward, weaving between the thick trunks, using the trees as obstacles. The forest seemed endless, the shadows growing darker as they sped through the dense undergrowth. Naira and Kellen gripped their seats tightly, their eyes wide with fear. Jack could feel their anxiety, but didn't have time to reassure them. The only thing that mattered now was getting them to safety. The transport behind them roared louder, trying to break through the trees. Jack could hear the sound of heavy metal scraping against bark as the military vehicle tried to push its way through the forest. But it wasn't built for this kind of terrain. The trees were too thick, and the vehicle's size made it clumsy. Still, it was closing in. Jack's mind raced for another escape route. He had one idea. There was a steep ravine ahead, a drop so sharp it could stop any pursuit. If he could make it there in time, they might be able to lose the soldiers for good. But it was a risky move. If they didn't make it in time, they'd be cornered. Jack's fingers gripped the wheel even tighter, the sweat dripping down his forehead. "Hang on," he shouted to Naira and Callan. He pressed the pedal to the floor, the transport picking up speed as they raced toward the edge of the ravine. The sound of the military vehicle behind them was deafening now, and Jack could hear the heavy thud of its tires crashing through the forest floor. They were close. The ravine came into view. It was just ahead, a sharp drop surrounded by jagged rocks. Jack's eyes focused on the cliffside, calculating their chances. It was too late to stop now. There was no turning back. He jerked the wheel to the right, sending the transport into a hard turn. The vehicle skidded dangerously, the tires scraping against the rough terrain as they headed straight for the edge. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. If he missed, if he didn't make it, they would fall, and everything would be lost. At the last possible moment, Jack slammed the brakes, and the transport skidded to a halt just inches from the edge of the ravine. The vehicle's nose tilted forward, but the brakes held, keeping them from tumbling over the edge. Jack exhaled sharply, his chest tight with the rush of adrenaline. They had made it. For now. Behind them, the military vehicle had slowed down as it reached the ravine's edge. It couldn't follow them anymore. The soldiers had no way of getting past the steep drop, and they couldn't risk driving any closer. Jack turned to Naira, who was staring wide-eyed out the window, her breath coming in short gasps. Callan was clutching his toy tightly, his small face pale but still trusting. "We're safe," Jack said quietly, though the words felt strange in his mouth. "For now." Naira nodded slowly, but Jack could see the weight of the situation on her face. They weren't out of danger yet. This was just the beginning of their escape. They needed to keep moving, to keep ahead of the soldiers and any other dangers that might come their way. "Where do we go now?" Naira asked, her voice calm but strained. Jack looked ahead, beyond the ravine. There were mountains in the distance, their peaks covered with snow, a symbol of the untamed wilderness that lay ahead. The perfect place to disappear. "We head for the mountains," he said firmly. "It's our best shot." Naira gave a small nod, her face set with determination. She trusted Jack now, and they both knew the risks they would face on this journey. But Jack had made his choice. He wasn't going to stop, not until Naira and Callan were safe. They would keep going, no matter what it took. Jack took one last look at the military vehicle behind them. It was backing away, retreating for now. But he knew this wasn't over. The chase was still on. The cold mountain air hit them as they made their way up the rocky trail, the sun now low in the sky. Jack, Naira, and Callan had been walking for hours, their steps slow and careful on the uneven ground. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks dusted with snow, creating a stunning yet intimidating view. It was a harsh, unforgiving place, but it was their best hope for survival. Jack glanced behind them. The military had been a threat, but for now, it seemed they were safe. They had managed to lose their pursuers, and the ravine had been a good escape. But Jack knew better than to let his guard down. He had to keep moving, keep them safe. The mountains were isolated, and there were fewer people here, but the environment was dangerous in its own way. "Do you think they'll follow us here?" Naira asked, her voice a little strained from the climb. Jack stopped for a moment, taking in the landscape ahead. The trail they were on was narrow, winding through dense trees and rocky outcrops. The forest gave way to a steep incline, and beyond that, the snow-covered peaks seemed almost unreachable, but it was the perfect place to hide. And for now, it was the only option they had. "I'm sure they'll try," Jack said, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of the situation. "But it'll take them time. We've got a head start. We just need to keep moving." Naira nodded, though Jack could see the worry in her eyes. She had been through so much already, and this journey wasn't over yet. She was strong, but even the strongest could only take so much. Callan, who had been silent for the last hour, tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Jack," he said in his soft, innocent voice, "are we going to be safe here?" Jack looked down at the small boy, his heart aching. He could see the fear in Kalen's eyes, the confusion that only a child could have when thrown into such an uncertain world. Jack kneeled down to Kalen's level, giving him a reassuring smile. "We're going to be okay, Kalen," Jack said softly. "We're going to keep going, and we'll find a safe place for you and your mom. I promise." Kalen's eyes brightened just a little, his grip on his toy loosening. Jack's words seemed to comfort him, at least for now. But Jack knew it wouldn't last forever. The road ahead would only get harder, and they would face many more challenges before they could find true safety. They continued their climb, moving higher up the mountainside. The air grew thinner, and the path became steeper, but Jack didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Naira and Kalen were counting on him, and he wasn't going to let them down. As they made their way through the rugged terrain, the quiet of the mountains wrapped around them. There were no sounds of other travelers, no signs of life. The only noises were the wind, the crunch of their footsteps on the snow, and the occasional call of a distant bird. It felt isolating, but in a way, it was comforting. Here, they could blend into the wilderness, disappear from the world for a while. "We should stop soon," Jack said after a while. "Get some rest. We'll need to be ready for whatever comes next." Naira agreed with a nod. She was clearly exhausted, but she didn't complain. Jack could tell she was pushing herself, just like he was. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, but they needed to recharge if they were going to make it through the night. Jack led them to a small cave tucked into the side of the mountain. It was not much, but it would shelter them from the cold. He checked the entrance to make sure it was safe, then motioned for Naira and Kalen to enter. They crawled inside, their movements slow and careful, and Jack followed. Inside, the cave was small but dry. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jack sat down, leaning against the rocky wall. He could feel the weight of the journey pressing on him, the exhaustion creeping into his bones, but he didn't show it. Not in front of Naira and Kalen. He had to remain strong for them. "I'll take the first watch," Jack said as he settled into a corner of the cave, his eyes scanning the darkened entrance. "You two get some sleep." Naira hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her face drawn with weariness. She laid down beside Kalen, wrapping her arms around him protectively. Jack could see the exhaustion on her face too. She hadn't let her guard down since they'd escaped the colony. And now, in the safety of the cave, she was finally able to rest. Jack stared out into the dark, his thoughts racing. They had come so far, but the road ahead was uncertain. The military wouldn't stop looking for them, and there were dangers in the mountains that they couldn't even begin to understand. He couldn't afford to fail them. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. As the wind howled outside, Jack closed his eyes for just a moment, but he didn't let himself sleep. His mind was focused on the path ahead, on keeping them safe. The night passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. But as the first light of dawn crept into the cave, Jack knew it was time to move again. The journey wasn't over, and the danger was still very real. But they had made it through one more night, and that meant something. They weren't out of danger yet, but Jack wasn't going to stop. Not until Naira and Kalen were free. The morning light shone brightly as Jack, Naira, and Kalen made their way down the narrow mountain pass. The air was crisp and cool, but there was something different today. After weeks of constant worry, of running, hiding, and surviving, Jack felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally getting somewhere. The mountain path had been difficult, but it had brought them closer to safety. The hard part was behind them now. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of relief in his words. His eyes scanned the path ahead. They had made it to the base of the mountains and were heading toward a small town, far from the chaos they had left behind. It was not much, but it was a fresh start. Naira walked beside him, her eyes focused on the road. She had been quiet for a while now, but Jack could see the change in her. She was still tired, but the worry that had haunted her for so long had started to fade. She had learned to trust him, and he had learned to trust her too. Together, they had been through more than either of them had expected, but they had made it this far. "I never thought it would end like this," Naira murmured as she glanced over at Jack. "I didn't think we'd survive." "We're not there yet," Jack reminded her, but his tone was gentle. He could see the relief on her face, and he didn't want to take that away. It had been a long, hard journey, but they had made it. "We're still not safe until we're out of here completely." Kellen, who had been walking silently between them, looked up at Jack with a tired smile. "Are we going to be okay now?" he asked, his small voice carrying a hint of hope. Jack's heart softened. The boy had been through so much, and despite the fear and confusion, Kellen had shown nothing but trust in him. Jack knelt down to Kellen's level and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to be just fine," Jack said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Kellen nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped turning, and everything was perfect. Jack's thoughts returned to Naira as she walked ahead, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It had been a tough road, but they had made it through. After a few more hours of walking, they finally reached the small town. It was quiet, peaceful even. The streets were not crowded, and the buildings were made of simple stone and wood, blending in with the natural surroundings. It felt like a place where they could disappear, where they could be safe. Jack paused at the entrance to the town and took a deep breath. It was strange to think that their journey was almost over. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. He could feel the weight of everything they had been through. But now, there was a new weight to carry, the weight of building a life from scratch. Naira turned to him. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Jack looked at the peaceful town before him. "We find a place to stay. We'll lay low for now, but I'll make sure you and Kellen are safe. That's my promise." Naira nodded, and Jack could see the relief in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was the best they could do. For now, it was enough. They needed time to heal, to recover from everything they had been through. As they walked into the heart of the town, Jack noticed a small inn on the corner. It wasn't much, but it looked like a good place to start. He turned to Naira and Kellen. "How about we start there?" he suggested. "We can rest, get something to eat, and figure out our next steps." Naira agreed, and they made their way inside. The innkeeper, an older man with a warm smile, greeted them as they entered. "Welcome," he said in a friendly voice. "You look like you've had a long journey." "We have," Jack replied, giving the man a small smile. "We'd like to stay for a while if that's okay." The innkeeper nodded and led them to a small room with 2 beds and a table. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and quiet, just what they needed. As they settled in, Jack took a deep breath and looked around the room. It felt like the first real moment of peace they had experienced in so long. They were no longer running. They weren't in hiding anymore. They were safe for now. And that was more than enough. Over the next few days, they began to adjust to their new life. Jack found work in the town, helping with various tasks around the area. It wasn't glamorous, but it provided for them. Naira began to rebuild her confidence, and Kellen was slowly starting to feel at home. Jack could see the change in them. They were healing, and for the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to think about the future. It wouldn't be easy, but they had made it through the hardest part. Together, they had survived. Together, they would build a new life. And as Jack sat by the fire that evening, watching Naira and Kellen play together, he realized something. He had found something he never thought he would. Family. And that made everything worth it.